One of the things that I have learned since I've been doing the practice of therapy and started doing consulting and doing the blog and the podcast is there's really three distinct kind of phases of private practice, or groups of people that are in private practice, at least the way that I conceptualize it. First of all, there's those folks that are just getting started. Maybe they're working for an agency and really kind of getting disenchanted with that type of work and want to figure out how to go out on their own and start a private practice. Or there's also in that same group maybe graduate students or people that have recently graduated from a program in counseling or therapy or social work, and they're trying to figure out how to go into private practice. And I call that the getting started phase. The other group that I see that is out there are folks that have already taken the leap and gotten into private practice, and they maybe have a solo practice or they're working in a group practice, and they're really trying to figure out how to take their practice to the next level and to actually grow their practice. It might be that they are really kind of feeling some stagnation in what they're doing and that they're not getting the number of clients that they would like to get, or maybe they're just trying to figure out their processes of how to better manage the business side of private practice and work more efficiently. And then the third group of people are those people that are really what I refer to as the scaling phase, or those people that have maybe built successful solo practices, but they're wanting to move to the next level where they start a group practice or really grow. Sometimes those people in that phase feel like they've really kind of reached a glass ceiling and they don't really know how to increase their income or move up another level. So regardless of which one of those phases you're in, the getting started phase, the growing phase, or the scaling phase, I would really love to have you as part of one of my mastermind groups. You've heard from me before if you listen to the podcast regularly. Mastermind groups are one of the best ways to really kind of learn from others and really get your practice to the next level. So take a look at that. I'm getting a mastermind group started in September of 2018, and I would love to have that conversation with you. There's no obligation to join the mastermind group, but I would love to just be able to have that conversation. So go over to practiceoftherapy.com/mastermind and apply to join a mastermind group. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. This is session number 45 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm your host, Gordon Brewer, and I'm so glad you found us, and I'm so glad you found the Practice of Therapy podcast and that you're listening to it. Welcome. If this is the first time for you to listen in to the podcast, I'm glad you're here, and I would invite you to go over and subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it, whether it be in Apple Podcasts or iTunes or over now at Google Play, and the Google Podcast app is a new thing that's come out. We're also available on Spotify and Stitcher and iHeartRadio and pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts. I think you can find us there. So take the time to subscribe to the podcast. It's been kind of a weird week for me. I've been maybe a little bit under the weather. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced vertigo, but I've been battling that this week. And I finally found, I knew kind of what was happening. There's this thing that happens in our inner ears where we can build up these kind of little granules or something going on in our inner ears, and we have to be able to get those out of there. And so, like most good clinical people, I looked it up on YouTube, and there's actually this cure for vertigo, if that's the type of vertigo you're having, where you do this kind of thing where you kind of do almost not really a somersault, but you put your head down and you turn it a certain way. And, it works. Now, I thought the room was going to spin out of control while I was doing that, but it did work. So, if any of you listening are having trouble with vertigo, it's a good cure and it does work. So, anyway, I digress. So on today's podcast, I've, as I've mentioned to many of you before, one of the things that I'm just so, I feel so grateful for and so, privileged to be able to do is to have conversations with different folks across the country and people, particularly other therapists that are building their private practices or are in practice, and just learning so much from them. My guest today is Jarrod Justice, and Jarrod and I met through a mutual friend of ours, David Hall. And if you've listened to the podcast for a while, David was back in episode number 4. And he was actually the first person I interviewed for this podcast. And David has been a great friend and colleague of mine for several years now. He and I serve on the board together for the Tennessee Marriage and Family Therapy Association. But David started a therapy practice that's really a psychiatry practice, and you can go back and listen to that episode. But anyway, Jarrod is working with David at Haven Family Psychiatry in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Jarrod did a presentation for one of our Tennessee Marriage and Family Therapy events, and it was just an intriguing topic for me. I think I've shared with many of you before, or if you don't know this, a kind of fun fact about me, or interesting fact maybe, is that in addition to my work as a therapist, I also happen to be a clergy person in the Episcopal Church. So I have, on the weekends and on Sundays, I kind of put on my clergy hat. It's really a clergy collar. So I always tell my clients that if you ever see me in the clergy collar, I don't like to catch people off guard by that. So sometimes I do wear that funny collar. But anyway, Jarrod and I were talking, had a conversation, and he did this presentation on caring for the caregiver, in particular working with pastors and clergy people, and just some of the issues that they can tend to deal with. Like counseling and therapy, clergy people do a lot of caregiving, and they've got people in their congregations that they work with and attend to on a pastoral level, and it can take a toll on you as a therapist. So in today's episode, we talk a little bit about self-care and just about being able to navigate some of the heavy stuff that we have to deal with as therapists and counselors. And also we talk about being able to integrate kind of spirituality with our counseling practices, and how that has created kind of a unique niche within our practices. There's a lot of folks out there that might be listening to this that consider themselves like Christian counselors or faith-based counselors, or in some form or fashion. And so we talk a little bit about being able to integrate those two worlds and being able to do it in an ethical way. So without further ado, here is Jarrod Justice. Well, folks, welcome again to the Practice of Therapy podcast. I'm so happy to have with me today Jarrod Justice. And Jarrod and I met a few weeks ago, I guess, well as the last month. Now that I think about it, Jarrod did a presentation for one of our Lunch and Learn events that the Tennessee Marriage and Family Therapy Association puts on. We try to do it once a month. But Jarrod came and he talked about taking care of pastors and caring for the caregiver. And I just thought it would be great to talk about on this podcast today a little bit about self-care as a therapist and those of us that are in these caring professions. So welcome, Jarrod. I'm glad you're here with us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So tell us, as I start with everyone, tell us a little bit about your private practice journey and where you're located and how you've gotten to where you are.
Sure. So I am new in practice in Knoxville, Tennessee. I work at Haven Family Psychiatry with some good folks here. And I love to work with marriages and families and individuals. I really, really enjoy couples work. It's probably my main passion.
Yeah, that's one of mine as well. So, so you, part of your background I know is that you've been a pastor or minister, and you've moved into this whole realm of being a therapist and being in private practice. And so tell us what that's been like for you and how you've kind of gone this direction in your whole career.
Sure. Well, so my wife and I started out as college pastors. We worked with a non-denominational Christian church here in town, and we were over at the University of Tennessee a lot, working with students. And a lot of times it was counseling. It was working through, the latest breakup or what's going to be my major. And from there, I was a lead pastor. And, somewhere in there for us, we had some kids, and 5, 3, and 1, I think at the time. And we actually, we were pretty tired and worn out, and ministry was taking a lot from us, and we did some counseling ourselves. And that really, I would say, primed the pump for me to want to go back and get some professional training, learning how to really help those that were in need and to pass along the help that had been given to me in the counseling office.
Right. Yeah. So, it's one of those things. I know, I think it was last year, it might have been a couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post just on being able to integrate our faith experiences, our faith-informed, our faith-based kind of practice modalities or whatever. I don't know exactly the best word for that, but I like to think of it in terms of practices having either having a purely secular type of practice where you don't necessarily have religion involved, and I think the majority of people kind of follow that line of thinking. Then there's some of us, like myself, where I have what I call, probably would fall into the category of a faith-informed practice. I think most of the listeners out there might know this, but if you don't, that's all right. In addition to my work as a therapist, I also happen to be a clergy person in the Episcopal Church, and so I've got that part of my life that is very much informs who I am. And then there's the other practices that are strictly faith-based practices where it's the focus is religion. And so you've kind of landed kind of where I have from what I know, Jarrod.
Sure. I think that there's so much of a person's life journey that involves spirituality as well as family background, a lot of things to consider as far as what's going on in our physical bodies, our biology and our psychology, and even our social spheres of influence. And so for me, I really enjoy the kind of the complex nature of working with people. I know some people want to just, write this and write that and say, okay, go out and you're going to be okay. But for me, one of the things that with ministry, I just really have enjoyed working with people along the way. And so for me, counseling is so much about the process, and it's really being able to help people in a holistic way think about, hey, how is the way I grew up affecting me today? Or how is my spirituality or my emotional world affecting me today? And how does that impact the problems that I'm coming into counseling for?
Right, right. And I know one particular niche that you've kind of identified that you're doing a lot of work in is just really kind of helping pastors and helping people that are caregivers kind of work through just the whole stress of that job. I think a lot of times people aren't aware of that. Just the stress that pastors and people that are church leaders and that sort of thing can tend to live under.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that ministry can be a job, if you're a pastor, if you're clergy, if you're a caregiver, you're taking care of a lot of people. And one of the things that, for me, taking care of college students or taking care of a congregation as a lead pastor in the church for about 4 years, there was such a joy in wanting to take care of others. But at the time, especially when we reached out to do some counseling ourselves, we began to ask the question, who's taking care of us? And I know some of the denominations, different churches or religious organizations might do a really good job with that. But I think it can be easy for ministers, pastors to be pretty isolated, or they find themselves, they're the ones that are trying to help, and they don't stop long enough to recognize, wow, I need some rest, or I need to work on some things in my relationships or my family. And so absolutely helping those that are helping others, it's just so important to slow down and to take inventory of how you're doing yourself.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things about just being in private practice. That's something that we have to constantly be aware of, especially for those folks that are maybe in solo private practice, where they're spending a lot of time with people's very heavy problems and having to process that not only with the client but also for themselves. What have you found? And I know in the presentation that you did at the Lunch and Learn event, you talked a lot about this. What are some of the key points of that you'd like for people to know?
Paying attention to what's happening in our emotions is a big part of this. I think I agree with you, Gordon, about, for us as counselors, it's the same type of thing that we can become fatigued. They call it compassion fatigue, right? Where you are constantly hearing really traumatic things, or constantly hearing about really major problems in relationships, these kinds of things, and it can begin to take a toll. And without us being able to really tap into our emotional world, I think we can ignore that. We can try to numb that. We can even use work as a way to escape from acknowledging some of those things. So the first thing that I like to maybe discuss with you, Gordon, a little bit, and hear some of your thoughts, but some of that emotional awareness, or even emotional intelligence, as some people call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I think just clinically, one of the things that in my supervision work, when working with people that are working towards licensure and working on that part of it, one of the things that I think is so important is to know yourself well, of really kind of understanding. And this is a question I end up asking a lot of my clients as well, is really asking that question, why do you think you are like you are? And really understanding, like you said, how your family of origin has played into that, of really kind of understanding your own development psychologically, and also just having a keen awareness of how outside influences affect you, in terms of, for example, if you've had your own trauma that you've had to deal with, or other things that have come in and out of our lives. So, so what other things are you becoming aware of as you kind of focus on this caring for the caregiver?
Right. And A quick story that I often tell,
Mm-hmm.
especially if people are trying to figure out what is this about emotions. Some people they grow up or they begin to talk about life, and everything is either happy or unhappy. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot more than just being happy or unhappy. There's a lot of nuances to what we're feeling.
Right.
Well, one of the stories, it was kind of a stupid teenager mistake, but when I was younger, had a 1986 Pontiac. It was my first car, and I drove it around town for several weeks, and my brake light kept coming on as I would mash on my brakes, right? And I thought, that's strange, but I didn't tell anyone. I just ignored it, but the brake light kept coming on. And I was horrified one day when my car wouldn't stop. And luckily, I walked away scot-free and didn't crash my car, didn't hurt anyone, but my brakes went out. And I
Uh-huh.
think a lot of times with emotions, we can ignore them. They can be blinking. We can sort of push that down or explain it away this way or that way. But really, you can't stop those emotions from blinking. We've got to somehow tune into that enough. Maybe it's just an oil change in our life, that kind of a thing. But if
Mm-hmm.
if there's a major feeling that we're pushing down, let's just say, hurt or fear or loneliness, things that are really hard to talk about. But if we don't clue into that, I think that we can really pay the consequences later on.
Right. Right. So what have you found in your own practice that you've been able to do to kind of help you with all of those things?
I think it's really a simple intervention. I think clinically it tends to really help people develop some insight in their emotional world. But I will put up kind of some core emotions on the whiteboard, or I'll print out like an emotional kind of color wheel. You can just Google like an emotional color
Mm-hmm.
wheel, I think, and just kind of see all the different colors of the way we respond in our inner world to certain experiences. I think we all want to feel glad. And when clients
Mm-hmm.
come in, it's usually because they're not feeling glad enough.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that when people begin to name things like sadness or anger or shame, it gives them permission to not only feel those negative emotions, and we'll write out some tendencies, the way that we're kind of coping with some of these things. And what happens is people begin to feel awake to what their heart's doing, and then begin to feel more glad. Not that they're
Mm-hmm.
feeling glad all the time, but without really being able to experience some of the negative emotions, it's difficult to feel joy in
Yeah.
my, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah, and I think it's another thing that I've found for myself is the importance of doing my own therapeutic work. I think there's two ways that I've noticed that I take care of myself,
Sure.
and one is just in doing therapy with others that might be struggling with some of the same kind of issues that I
Right.
might be going through, because it's a kind of cathartic thing that happens, and that you end up saying to others what you really need for yourself. And that's pretty insight, something that I've really kind of learned over the years. The other thing is just kind of putting my money where my mouth is that I'm a
Right.
believer in therapy, and that
Right.
is getting my own therapy and finding
Right.
another therapist that works with me in kind of that role, something something beyond just kind of case supervision, but really looking at my own issues and looking at my own stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for me, whether it's another therapist, a pastor, a mentor, trusted friends, it's such a risk to talk about what's going on the inside. And,
Hmm.
and for me, it's been always helpful, even though it can be scary, to talk about how I'm doing with a
Yeah.
trusted individual. And yeah,
Right.
so for me, I absolutely grew leaps and bounds, I would say, in my own journey when I had some therapy. And what a safe place to be able to, I like the word excavate. It's like thinking of an archaeologist or someone digging for a dinosaur. Sometimes
Yeah.
you're dusting off some things. Oh, I thought it was a rock. Oh, wow, it's actually a T-Rex there that I need to that I need to unearth. There can be a lot that we cover up or try to ignore just over time. There can be past hurts or failures or just big questions in our lives that if we don't have someone to process with, we can get really isolated and develop some unhealthy coping habits.
Right. I remember that, when I first was in graduate school and first going through the whole training process, I can remember one of the things, I guess the one course that that really made one of the bigger impacts on me was our groups course. And we had this a wonderful professor and therapist, Graham Disk, over at ETSU. I don't know if Graham ever listens to this, but anyway, shout out to him. But Graham was a great mentor in that I remember the group of people I was going through graduate school, we really bonded a lot because we did group therapy together. Absolutely. I mean, we actually did therapy with each other, and it makes a huge impact. And it really, I think the hardest thing for anyone to do is just be vulnerable. But I think when we do that at work ourselves, it just makes us a much better therapist and caregiver with the clients that we have.
Yes. Well, and speaking of vulnerability, if I can be real for just a moment, I think something like Facebook or Twitter, some of these social media platforms that really can be so helpful. Sometimes in my own life, outlets like that can almost feel like fast food. It fills me up, but it doesn't quite give me that nutrients that I'm needing relationally. And so I've really had to be honest, kind of limit some of my social media intake, kind of stopping eating the Big Macs, right? And what it's done is it's made me want to reach out for real connection. Sometimes I use it's kind of a silly word, but real relationships. So face to face, and even though we're not face to face right here, Gordon, we've been able to have some of that face-to-face time, and you really just can't replace that. And I think that's why counseling can be so powerful, or like a group therapy situation like you're talking about, where so much of it is about the interpersonal and authentic connection to a real person that is part of the journey in our healing and us learning how to navigate life together. Because I don't think we're made to do it on our own, right?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think we thrive best in the context of community and being able to collaborate with each other. That's one of the things I know a little bit about the practice that you're in there in Knoxville. We've got our mutual friend, and if you're listening to this, if you go back and listen to, I believe it's podcast episode number 4, I interview our friend and colleague David Hall, who started the practice that you actually are working at, the Haven Family Psychiatry. And so to switch gears a little bit, Jarrod, how was it that you kind of came to the decision to kind of go that route in private practice versus going out on your own or going, to work for an agency or something?
Yeah, sure. For me, I really value trust in the workplace. I think for me, I had an opportunity to get to know Dr. Hall, David Hall, who was my supervisor here. And it was a great fit, not just because there was a lot of trust. He had actually been a adjunct faculty for Richmont Graduate University. And so if there's any Richmont grads I'll just say hello to you guys. But that's where I did my degree and got my master's in marriage and family therapy there. And so I met David and his wife, Brandy. And so part of it was the relationship. And then the other part was I really wanted to pursue dual licensure, as a marriage and family therapist, but also as a LPC, licensed professional counselor in Tennessee. And part of it for me too, along with those things, are that I really, for me, Gordon, being able to be a part of a team where it's not just I'm in a kind of a cave, isolated, doing my own thing, but there's so much consultation that will happen. My colleague Kelsey, who's working here, Kelsey McLaughlin, she just came on staff as well. She does a lot of great work here, and we're just wanting to collaborate, and holistically.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that one myth that I like to dispel for people, especially going into this whole realm of private practice, is this idea that the other therapists in your community or other people that you have around you are really not competition. They are people that you can collaborate with. I think there's a scarcity mentality that we can get caught up in, and that there's not enough clients to go around, or they're going to steal clients from us or something along those lines. And I think that is a big myth, because the truth of the matter is there are enough people out there that need and want our services that there's plenty to go around. And I think the more you can take kind of a collaborative approach, it's always going to be a win-win kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the phase of practice that I find myself in is networking, marketing, because I am new in practice here, and I've been so fortunate to meet some great therapists and other ministers in town. And I think to collaborate, to network, to have those check-ins with people, even if it's a cup of coffee or a lunch. Hey, tell me what you're doing, and here's where I could help if you need help there. It's important. I think the teamwork that could happen in different cities, it's an important part to this.
Yeah, it really is. So the other part of what you're doing, Jarrod, is that you really, as we talked about in the beginning, is that you've really kind of been able to integrate to some degree your faith with your private practice. And one of the things that I'm really kind of becoming more and more aware of is that there are a lot of people out there that are doing what I would refer to as faith-informed practices. They've got the clinical training and really adhere to those clinical and ethical standards, but at the same time, there's a spiritual component that comes into it based on their, number one, based on their own life experience, but also because there are clients coming to us that are asking about that or that are wanting that. So what are you finding on that around all of that?
Sure. Well, for us here at Haven Family Psychiatry, we talk about wanting to give a faith-based approach, but we're also wanting to respect the values of our clients. And so a lot of times I'll just point blank ask my clients, would you like a faith-based perspective? I have a lot of clients that'll say yes, or others will say, no, I'm not really wanting that. Or others that will say, maybe something kind of in the middle. And so it's really different with every person that I've seen. And I kind of joke that since I've been a pastor that I'm not going to take one of my Bibles off the shelf and beat anybody with it.
Yeah.
But I want to be respectful. I want to be kind. I want to, sometimes as we begin talking about spirituality, one of the questions I like to ask is, what can you tell me about your spirituality if you want to talk about that? What would you like me to know, if anything, about your relationship with God? Or what do you believe about God? And so I don't assume that what my clients believe is what I believe. And so it can be a really great conversation, and a huge part of the counseling process that I think can be looked over.
Right.
And people can walk on eggshells. Oh, well, we can't talk about spirituality, but it absolutely bleeds into the other parts of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I had my previous podcast episode with Jeff Gunther. He was talking about some of the research that he's done into what do people look for when they're trying to find a therapist for themselves. And one of the things that he said was just a really significant thing is that people want to know, aren't really so much concerned with training and credentials and, the letters after our name and all of that kind of thing. What they really are interested in more is, who is this person that I'm going to go see, and what is it that has shaped their life. And particular if, there's been, there's in my own practice, one of the things that I have kind of my standard spiel that I do at the beginning with new clients. And part of what I tell them is, in addition to my work as a therapist, I also happen to be a clergy person in the Episcopal Church. And sometimes you might come in and I might have on a funny collar, and I don't want to catch you off guard by that. But the other thing that I like for them to know about that is that I don't have a religious agenda with my counseling. But if those are things they want to talk about or need to talk about, that is something that I'm open to and enjoy talking about and have a lot of fun with. And I think what that, the big thing that does is, it's not me trying to proselytize them or me trying to convince them of seeing things another way, is that it gives some disclosure about me, that those things are safe to talk about, and it's also safe for them to not talk about it. And so it just kind of opens things up. I would say the majority of the time when I mention that, particularly where we're located here in East Tennessee, I always say that we're at the belt buckle of the Bible Belt.
Yes.
Yeah. It comes up for people. And
cool.
Yeah.
Well, and a comment that I'll make about this, I think, church, any kind of religious conversation can really stir either really great feelings, or it can stir really difficult feelings from the past. If someone's been in a bad church experience, or they've been hurt by someone in the church, or by a leader, or maybe it was a good experience at one point in their life, but now they're feeling a little bit lost in their journey. I would say absolutely, that's one of my jobs as a counselor, is to hopefully make it a safe place for people to be honest and really discover kind of where they are in that journey spiritually, because it can be really hard to talk about, especially if you are in the church that having a hard time in, or you don't want to talk about someone behind their back, those kinds of things. But the counseling can be a safe place to sort of pick up the rocks and what's underneath that. What was your part to play in that experience? Because there's a church on every corner here in Knoxville, and you can't really say the word church or Jesus and not get some kind of reaction.
Right. And I think that the other thing too, just from a clinical side, there are any number of clients that have been actually injured or wounded by their church experience or spiritual experiences, and that they've come up against prejudice and hatred and those kinds of things, and it just has been a big turnoff for them. And I think my job as a therapist is just to hear that from them and not try to change their mind about anything, but be the listening ear around all of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I like how you said that you're not coming in with a religious agenda. I think that just being that listening ear, just giving compassion and empathy to the person's experience. I did some research myself on spiritual abuse, and maybe this is opening up a can of worms for another podcast, but that, we hear in the news about things like workplace bullying or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, these kinds of things. And I think something like the topic of spiritual abuse doesn't get a lot of press because it can be so subtle. I think there can be subtle places where there's manipulation or bullying. People might have good intentions, but in the end, it can be really, really difficult to discern what was even happening in some of the experiences. And so different clients that I've had, obviously wanting to be ethical here, where I don't want to give away any information or anything, but, people have been so hurt, similar to the way someone might come in and they're hurt by a father or a mother, or maybe a workplace where they were accused of something. I think that there can be a lot of, I guess a good counseling phrase, a bit like working through. There can be a lot of the working through of experiences in a safe place, and counselors are so good at that. They need to be. I want to grow in that myself, but it's going to be a safe place to work through this.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's the word that comes to mind for me is that people can be by different churches and different church leaders. They can, quite frankly, just be bullied by them, and I think having a safe place to process all of that is Absolutely. Such an important piece. Yeah. Well, Jarrod, I'm aware of our time, and I know that there's so much about all of this that we could talk about, and hopefully it's maybe gotten some spurred some thoughts for some other people listening to this, especially those other therapists and counselors that are out there that maybe are in a position or in a place where their own spirituality, their own faith practices, that sort of thing, inform who they are as a person, and to being able to integrate some of that into their practice in an ethical way.
Well, thank you, Gordon. It's been an honor.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you join me, and hopefully we can do it again here soon.
I'd love to. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks. Well, folks, I hope this has been a helpful topic for today's podcast. It was a little different in that it's been a little more of a clinical focus and just really hopefully getting you to think about your own self-care and just being able to take care of yourself and take care of other caregivers that might be out there that come into our practices that seek our services. For any of you out there that might be in what you would consider faith-based practices or incorporate spirituality with your practices, I'd love to hear from you, because one of the things that I think I might be interested in doing is doing just a whole series here on the podcast about that particular topic. I know had that conversation with one of my earlier podcast guests, Whitney Owens. Her husband is a pastor, and I know that's an important part of their their lives and what she's doing in her practice as well. And so it's I think it's a great niche, and I think it's one that speaks to a lot of people. I think, as you probably heard from me, it's religion is not something that I tend to push. Certainly I have a lot of personal convictions about that, but I'm a very open-minded clergy person. And I think you'll know from listening to me that I'm also very much, for me, it's very much about compassion and showing compassion for others, and and really getting away from just kind of an agenda of judgment or hatred towards anyone or for any reason. I'm very open to, I guess, very embracing of LGBTQ issues and transgender issues, racism. Those kinds of things are things that are, quite frankly, I feel like we need to speak to and end in our country. So I don't want to get too political here, but I think that is something that certainly needs our voice. And my personal belief is that in my own church work, I'm speaking to those issues, and that if you don't know about the Episcopal Church, it's a very inclusive church and very welcoming to all, regardless of their background or their culture. So anyway, I didn't mean to digress that much. But anyway, thanks for listening today. I'll put in the show notes Jarrod's contact information. So I forgot to ask him about that at the end of the podcast. But also, if you are really kind of feeling stuck in your practice and feel like you need some help, reach out to me. I'd love to have you as part of a mastermind group. I think it will make a huge difference in your practice and what you're doing, and give you some support, as we talked about today, that self-care that is so important. So take care, folks. Thanks again for listening in. Go ahead and go over there and subscribe wherever you're listening to this, and leave a review. I'm glad. I love to hear those honest reviews of the podcast. Take care, folks. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.